Okay. So thank you so much to all of you for being present. Today, so this seminar is organized at the Collège International de Philosophie, which is like a research center created around like 40 years ago by Jacques Derrida. And it is also, this seminar is also supported by Centre Walras-Pareto at the Lausanne University, where I am a junior lecturer, but also Université Cité, because when the seminar is organized in person, the in-person sessions of the seminar are held at that university in Paris. So today I have the immense pleasure of welcoming Janek Wasserman, who is a historian who has written on a large number of topics specifically related to European intellectual history, history of modern Germany, history of Central Europe, history of economic thought, and the Holocaust. He has written a large number of papers on these different topics, which are nevertheless very much related. But he's also the author of two really amazing books that I highly encourage all of you to read. One is called Black Vienna, the Radical Right in the Red City, 1918 to 1938. And the second one that I had the pleasure of reading specifically a year ago is called The Marginal Revolutionaries, How Austrian Economists Fought the War of Ideas, which was published in 2019 by the Yale University Press, and which also received the Joseph Spengler Prize of the History of Economic Society's Best Book in 2020. And this book was really a revelation for me, both methodologically and in terms of its content. I mean, I have personally worked on the economic thought of Ludwig von Mises in my previous research. I was amazed by Janek's ability to combine intellectual and social history this well. I mean, this is very difficult. I was telling Janek before the talk that often it's much easier to focus either on purely intellectual history or on social history, but really combining the two is tricky, and specifically combining the two in a very fruitful way is extremely challenging, but I think Janek has managed to do so in the best possible way. And other than that, I think the book is frankly very measured appraisal of the legacy of Austrian economics. It shows the diversity, the great diversity of perspectives within the school, but also, for example, there are so many people, we often tend to forget that the Austrian school, there were so many people, very different sometimes, affiliated to this school at different times. We often tend to focus entirely only on Mises or Hayek, whereas there are other people. And it is true that some of the more problematic aspects of the Austrian school often emerge from those who are almost entirely inspired by Mises and Hayek. And in fact, the book shows that we can find among other members of the Austrian tradition a large number of highly ingenious figures who could allow us to maybe rethink the legacy of the Austrian school in new ways somehow. But this is already too long. I should again thank you so much, Janek, for having accepted my invitation. I'm really grateful for the opportunity, and without any further ado, I give you the floor. You will have between 60 to 75 minutes, and depending on the length of your talk, we will have around 40 to 55 minutes for the Q&A. So please, the floor is yours.
All right. Thank you, Sina, so much for this invitation. Thank you, everybody, for coming out today. It really is an honor to get to talk about this research subject, which I found so fascinating as well. I came at this as an intellectual historian from my training as a scholar of Central Europe, of European intellectual history, of Austrian intellectual history. And after completing my first book, the second book came out fairly naturally because in looking at struggles between Catholic conservatives and Austro-Marxists and socialists, which I did in the first book, the liberals that fall somewhat in the middle, who didn't have an easy political home, didn't get a full telling. So that's where the project initially came from. But for me, as an intellectual historian, I'm mostly interested in sociology of knowledge, the sociology of intellectuals. I'm always interested in how ideas matter, which means trying to understand how ideas are transmitted and disseminated, what sorts of institutions support or propagate ideas. And one of the things that was so fun about studying the Austrian School of Economics, not as a devotee of the school itself, was that definitionally, it was hard to get one's head around it. And partly that is because there is such a diversity of figures, and partially it was because it's a moving target. It changed over time how it was understood. Sometimes the school idea was understood in a pejorative or a negative sense. Sometimes it was understood in a positive sense of a badge of honor. And so trying to tease apart these different meanings was an underlying problematic that I continued to engage throughout the work. And so returning to that for this talk is mostly going to involve how Austrians at various times in different generations, as we refer to them, understood whether they operated within a school or what a school might be or what their group entailed. And this has a number of different possible permutations. There are historical accountings of what the school is. There are conceptual or definitional ones. There are metaphorical ways of understanding Austrianness. And I think we're going to see these differences as we make our way through the talk. So there are, I think, a lot of difficulties to unravel. And as we think about schools in particular, this is a subject of ongoing discussion in sociology of knowledge, of course, and science studies. There are difficulties to unravel. Does a school require a coherent body of ideas or a core set of principles or dogma? One of the preoccupations that we often see with contemporary Austrian economists, as they call themselves, is this search for principles, values, and thinkers. But what was really interesting as I was getting ready for this talk is I referred to the definition offered by one of the leading Austrians today. And in a very long piece where he offers 10 different propositions associated with the school, Peter Badiei, who's at George Mason University, also makes this fascinating comment, which I think gets at the crux of what we're doing today. He says, quote, "While one could argue that a unique Austrian school of economics operates within the economics profession today, one could also sensibly argue that the label Austrian no longer possesses any substantive meaning." He then goes on to lay out 10 principles for what he calls what so-called Austrians believed. So he introduces a category of so-called Austrians. Maybe that's what we have today. And that just points to it, that in an article dedicated to the Austrian School of Economics, the very author and a proponent of the school can say maybe it doesn't even mean anything today. I find that fascinating. And so hopefully we can tease out why it is so difficult to just pinpoint what this is. Okay. Another person, I'm going to return to this quotation later, who I think gives us a good sense, is the quotation I started this paper with. Sorry, I'll go back. "We cultivated neither school nor community nor sect." That actually comes from Ludwig von Mises' memoir, written in the 1940s, translated in the 1980s from German to English. This was him talking about the seminar that he established in the 1920s and was the basis, the focus of the tradition in the interwar period. Nevertheless, the person who becomes most associated with a school or a dogmatic approach here makes the claim that that's not what they were about. a school or a community or a sect, because clearly the notion of a school suggested something narrow or doctrinaire that was not Mises's intention in having this open conversation, which took place actually in the spot that I have behind me right now, the Stubenring Wirtschaftskammer in Vienna. So it is really interesting, that generation that includes Mises and Schumpeter, Joseph Schumpeter. This is the immediate pre-war third generation of the so-called school, had a real reluctance when it came to notions of schools. Because the idea of a strict dogma or a series of principles was problematic for Schumpeter on sociological grounds, because for him, schools are sociological realities or living beings. They have structures, relations between leaders and followers. They have flags, battle cries, moods, all too human interests. For the Austrian school, they also had drinking songs and all sorts of other emblems of the tradition. Antagonisms come from within the general sociology of group antagonisms. Victory and conquest, defeat and loss of ground are in themselves values for such schools and part of their very existence. We can see they will try to appropriate labels that are considered honorific or affix derogatory labels to the work of the enemy. So to skip down, this gives scope to personal vanities, interests, and propensities to fight that may count for more than any real issues. In fact, to the point of obliterating the real issues. So there is this element that schools are partially about ideas and theories and institutions, but they're also about people, vanities, and interactions. And we see this quite clearly, as we will see as I venture a little bit further. So we will start out early on with the founding generations, the key figures. This is an image from the University of Vienna. This is their honorific Arkadenhof. This is the main atrium where in sequence you have plaques dedicated to Carl Menger, Eugen von Böhm-Bawerk, and Friedrich von Wieser, the first three main figures in the school. And so this is where we're going to start. We can, if we use a sociological approach, sort of in the ways that Schumpeter suggested, we can discern several phases in this story. These are rough categorizations, yet they assist us in tracking the school's evolution. And we can see the very notion of a school transform in this process. While traditionally we go back to 1871 to Carl Menger's investigation, Principles of Economics, which you see pictured here as the founding text, really there isn't a meaningful school that exists before the 1880s. And in fact, the first times we hear reference, as I'll show in a second, it was really a pejorative term. Again, vanities and rivalries from German historians. Economists. So we will retreat to this text. Carl Menger, seen as the founder of this tradition and this school, publishes his seminal book in 1871, The Principles of Economics. The book is seen as part of a wave of people thinking in terms of marginal utility. These aren't the first figures, but this has sometimes been conceived as a revolution. Menger is grouped alongside William Stanley Jevons and Leon Walras as key figures in ushering in this new tradition. However, at the time, Menger's book was viewed much more modestly. And in fact, I think it was intended more modestly than to occasion a full revolution. The book was really a textbook in nature. It was fairly conceptually dense and difficult, and it attracted some readers, but not a large number of them. Moreover, Menger was trying to make a gesture to the prevailing German-speaking economics and social scientific community. He dedicated the book to the leading figure in the German historical school at the time, Wilhelm Roscher. And he sent a friendly greeting to his German allies in the process of codifying economic knowledge. He said, "Let this work be regarded as a friendly greeting from a collaborator in Austria and as a faint echo of the scientific suggestions so abundantly lavished on us Austrians by Germany through the many outstanding scholars she has sent us and through her excellent publications," unquote. So this was seen as a gesture. It was seen as part of an ongoing conversation. It was seen as actually part of a German-speaking tradition that was trying to advance economics beyond British political economy. While indebted to it, while Menger cared a great deal about Adam Smith's work in particular and David Ricardo's work, nevertheless, it challenges British political economy in meaningful ways, especially ideas around labor theories of value. In the course of the next decade, however, Menger sharpened his critique of the methodological approach of Germans. He had some frustration about the lack of reception of his book. And so he engaged more directly in a methodological inquiry, publishing a work in 1883 called The Investigations into the Methods of the Social Sciences. Its tone and its content diverged quite clearly in that it tried to stake out a clear space for a much more deductive and theoretical approach to economics than the empirically and statistically and historically oriented German school was currently using. Menger in this text begins to create space. He argues that German economics had ventured onto a false path and risked isolation from the rest of the economics profession if it did not heed his approach. He said that their fixation on statistics and empirics was a misleading fixation. It was one-sided and it was unintelligible. Instead of appealing to German scholars, he attacked them for limited and shoddy work. Quote, "Misunderstandings have played a decisive part in the reform of political economy by its German practitioners," unquote. This, of course, antagonized German-speaking scholars, especially members of what was called the younger German historical school, most notably Gustav Schmoller, the leader of this generation. And this culminated in 1883 and 1884 in a debate or a struggle over methods, the Methodenstreit. Menger and Schmoller went back and forth, throwing accusations at one another, engaging in theoretical disputes, but also personal attacks. Schumpeter would later call this a history of wasted energies, but this was a very clear dividing line where people more inclined towards deductive and theoretical work began to split off from the German empirical, historical, and statistical work. And it did lead people to recognize that something new was happening in the Austrian Empire. And it attracted some meaningful adherence. I'm just going to have some images of people behind us for a while. This is Carl Menger. So he's the one who's involved in this. And then that, this is, that is Gustav Schmoller. So these are the two main figures and antagonists in the Methodenstreit. But what's really interesting is as much as the school is characterized by Menger, what we really see is by the 1880s, another generation of scholars who had been trained across German-speaking Central Europe, but with their home base in Vienna, began to rise to prominence and began doing new work. And they engaged in a number of different social scientific inquiries, but also in policy applications. So from the very beginning, the Austrians involved in creating a tradition were always more than theoreticians. In fact, many of them would be government ministers or bureaucrats, policy advocates, and engage with the Habsburg state. So there are a number of figures, I'm not going to name a lot, but their studies range from studies of costs and value theory to the origins of interest and capital, to the role of business profits in the economy, to the value of things like progressive taxation or the role of the entrepreneur. But Austrian authors, Habsburg authors in Vienna, Prague, Innsbruck, Czernowitz, other locations, announced their presence in the 1880s to the academic world. The most notable, of course, will become the basis for kind of two strains of the school, Böhm-Bawerk and Wieser, who I mentioned before. And what they did is not just innovate in their theoretical work. Böhm-Bawerk's work on capital and interest, on roundabout production methods, on time preferences remains important. Friedrich Wieser's work on opportunity costs and marginal utility theory and imputation still resonate. But what really makes them important beyond just their theoretical work is their international linkages, their attempt to establish an audience broadly, and their understanding that Austrian ideas were never developed in a vacuum, even if they were cultivated there, that they were part of larger trends. By the 1880s, their works begin, by the end of the 1880s and really 1890s, their works are read by foreign scholars. They begin to get translated. And what we see in the early editions of journals in English and in Italian, less so in French, but what we see in early editions of economics journals is articles appearing that try to define what this school is. Articles on the Austrian School or the Austrian theory of value. So here we have Böhm-Bawerk, who will be a key organizational and institutional figure, as we'll see. Here's Wieser, who will be important for the interwar generation in particular. This is a copy of Friedrich Wieser's piece in the Economic Journal out of England from 1891, where he talks about the existence of this Austrian school and their theory of value grounded in individual preferences, subjective valuations. But we're going to see this is actually a fairly eclectic document in the way it tries to define what the Austrians are about. What we do see as a consequence of the work, less so of Menger, who in many ways retreats behind the scenes. He teaches until 1903, but doesn't publish a lot. He does publish some important things, but he retreats. But it's Wieser and Böhm's work in particular that leads to references to Austrian economists, to a, quote, Menger school, or an Austrian school in scholarly literature. A review in 1886 of Böhm's seminal work on capital and interest highlighted the linkage between Menger and this new generation. And here's a quote from the review. With the logical acuity typical of the Menger school, he, referring to Böhm-Bawerk, placed individual theories under his knife and pared away many outgrowths. However, the author of this review also said that there was something really positive going on, because while Menger was hard to read and understand, Böhm not so much. Quote, in contrast to the other achievements of the Menger school, it leaves nothing to be desired in clarity or elegance. So something positive seems to be developing with this new group of scholars, indebted, of course, to Menger, but also bringing in a series of other strands. Now, these early members never saw themselves solely as economists, let alone just as theoreticians. They saw theory, empirical science, and also policy applications as all discrete fields equally worthy of engagement, and most of them engaged in multiple ones of these. So their work was not just intellectual, but also socio-political. As we get into the 1890s, they really increased their political profile and extended their work to matters of civic concern, entering into what really becomes a public phase of this school. They weigh in on things like progressive taxation in Austria, on whether to maintain the gold standard. They begin talking about infrastructure projects and using marginal utility theory to defend state outlays on infrastructure and education. So they do this major work. One of the key figures in this who doesn't get talked about, and just to give you an example, is Emil Sachs, who was a colleague of Wieser's in Prague. He was actually a few years younger than Menger, and he vied with Menger for recognition. Eventually, he ends up in Prague at the German-speaking university in 1879. And he publishes a work called The Grundlegung der theoretischen Staatswirtschaft, the Foundation of Theoretical State Economics. And what he tried to do in this work was use this new subjective theory of value and apply it into public policy. He felt that economists had shown the scientific nature of microeconomics, or what he called private economics, But he felt that economists had not gone far enough into understanding how similar theories could be used to understand state economies or social economics. They had to devise a more theoretical approach to state policy. Since he believed that state economics operated according to the same principles as the private economy, he began using marginal utility concepts at the state level to provide a better foundation for policies on trade, taxation, finance, public enterprise, entrepreneurship. So he, in fact, and many of the Austrians of this generation advocated for state intervention in areas where the private economy did not adequately satisfy collective needs: defense, transport, public utilities, market regulation. And they proposed taxes and fees on private goods and large incomes, so that in order to cover complete life ends, because these ends weren't usually covered through individual initiative. Otherwise, the state should be more of a night watchman. For the most part, the state should remain out of market functions, but not completely removed, as we can see. I referenced Sachs and went into a bit of detail because Sachs is approvingly referenced by both Böhm and Wieser as they try to define what the school is doing in those early articles about the school. In 1891, Böhm and Wieser each authored articles in English language journals intended to popularize this new school. Böhm argued that marginal utility was a critical rejoinder to gaps in classical economics and to the German historical method. However, while practical concerns were important, theory was primary. Quote, "The province of the Austrian economics is theory in the strictest sense of the word." Nevertheless, Böhm, the theoretician, acknowledged that Austrians were working on a wide array of topics, including work on wages, rent, profit, finance, and policy. And of course, Böhm himself would be finance minister on 3 occasions in the 1890s and early 1900s. Wieser argued along similar lines. He recognized that science seeks its highest laurels on the field of observation and maintained that Austrians viewed themselves as experimentalists first and foremost. He suggested that there were 3 directions that Austrians were innovating and would continue to innovate in subsequent decades. 1, in the critique of socialist and communist economies and economics. 2, in economic theory and more specifically methodology. And finally, in public finance and state economics. Wieser believed in state regulation of the economy and progressive taxation, both on economic but also on ethical grounds. He suggested that the wealthy, who derived more benefits from state services than the poor, should pay much more for those advantages. These individuals, Wieser, Sachs, Böhm, are part of this massive wave of the late 1880s and early 1890s of younger Austrians who are producing a new kind of school. We see a steady stream of works between 1884 and 1887, yet really it's 1888 through 1892 where we see new heights achieved by the school, with about a dozen different Austrians publishing important works. So much so that even Gustav Schmoller, Menger's nemesis, had to acknowledge it, begrudgingly admitting there was now an emergence of a, quote, younger Austrian school. One of the more compelling works, and I mention this work because these will be individuals who get kind of frozen out of the story a little bit later, are Rudolf Auspitz and Richard Lieben. I will pull up, it's these 2 gentlemen. They are not only colleagues and co-authors, but they are related by marriage. There's a major palais on the Ringstrasse that's named the Palais Lieben-Auspitz. These families were closely interknitted through business practices, theoretically, and from personal ties. But these 2 individuals get frozen out of the story a little bit. They were more mathematically inclined than many of the other early Austrians. And so they took the Viennese work and marginal utility in different directions, bridging a gap toward Walras in Lausanne and to other scholars internationally. In their Untersuchungen über die Theorie des Preises, investigations on the theory of price, they looked beyond just Vienna for inspiration. They relied on graph, curve, and set theories to try to plot interactions between use and demand, supply and demand, cost and supply, and other core concepts, which they tried to understand in dynamic and interactive ways. As a result, they are often viewed as independent co-originators of indifference curves. And in many ways, they also anticipated some of Pareto's work on imperfect competition and monopoly prices. They also did work, given that their families were involved in banking, on stocks, stock markets, banking, and finance policy. And their work, in fact, was cited approvingly by Irving Fisher in the teens and 1920s. While their use of mathematics distanced them from other Austrians, nevertheless, members of the pre-war school, most notably Wieser and a young Joseph Schumpeter, would see them as important figures in this tradition, especially as it bridged into international contexts. So for people like Wieser and Schumpeter, what's important in a school would be what's being innovated and the extent to which it is interacting with a broader social and intellectual milieu. If we move forward, in the interest of time, from this second generation of Böhm and Wieser, Sachs, Lieben, and Auschwitz, the third pre-World War I generation also had to wrestle with their place, Austria's place, in the economics field, and in particular with their relationship to their predecessors. We've already seen, of course, Schumpeter, and I'll talk a little more about him, and his ambivalence toward the very idea of schools. Nevertheless, Schumpeter, Ludwig von Mises, and another gentleman by the name of Hans Meyer, who is less known, laid claim to the mantle of this younger generation. They had been trained mostly by Wieser, a little bit by Böhm, but nevertheless, they laid claim to this with their early publications. Schumpeter, he studied under Böhm and Wieser, and also Eugen von Filipovich, who had one of the most popular textbooks of the time, a sort of synthetic work that tried to popularize Austrian marginal utility ideas in a broader economics context. And he, Schumpeter that is, very quickly jumped into the methodological discussions that were swirling around the Austrian school, but also German social science as a whole. What he argued very early on is that economics required greater methodological precision. He found earlier divisions as demonstrated in the Methodenstreit as unproductive, and he believed that mathematical forms could offer clarity for both historical and exact economics. However, this couldn't be the sum total of all economics. So while he spoke approvingly of people like Cournot, Jevons, Walras-Pareto, Irving Fisher, he also felt that statistics, historical analysis, and sociology would also need to find a place. Theory, empirical data, all belong together. In his first major monograph, he displayed, again, this ambivalence about ideas about schools, because schools for him were narrow, petty, vain. So he says in this text, quote, "The oppositions within our discipline come to seem unbridgeable, but that is not my standpoint. Almost every approach and every individual author is justified in his claims." Schumpeter thought that synthesis rather than conflict over dogma would advance economics. He wanted to dispense with notions of schools or systems entirely. Another quote, "It is merely on the grounds of expediency that I speak of a Ricardo system, of an Austrian school, etc." Unquote. Nevertheless, in spite of his cautious attitude, he admitted that he owed his greatest debt to Friedrich Wieser and Leon Walras, to whom I stand, nearest to whom I stand, unquote. Now that said, despite his reluctance, Schumpeter's work grated on his mentors somewhat. While Wieser was fulsome in praising Schumpeter, saying that he, quote, combined scientific acuity with artistic freedom, unquote, nevertheless, Wieser dismissed Schumpeter's eclecticism or syncretism. He says, quote, Schumpeter indeed adheres very closely to the theoretical orientation to which I belong, and he names me as one of the authors with whom he most closely associates. But for my part, I must declare that he only agrees with this orientation in its results, while he rejects its psychological method. Whoever accepts our results must also accept our methods. So Wieser is a little bit damning here, saying that he doesn't appreciate that Schumpeter doesn't appreciate the subjective and psychological qualities that for Wieser are coming to define this approach. And so this was problematic in seeing Schumpeter as closely allied. And for Wieser, Schumpeter's synthesis had really arrived at an impossible muddle. But what we also see is that the previous Catholic approach, open-minded and tolerant approach to the school that Wieser had advocated in 1891 had considerably narrowed between that period and the review in the late 1900s, the first decade of the 1900s. The case with Ludwig von Mises at this time is also fraught and complex. Let me move my pictures forward a little bit. Here's our friend Schumpeter. I tried to find a picture of him when he is a young man as opposed to when he's older, the bald head that's quite distinctive. So here is Schumpeter. Here is a youngish Ludwig von Mises. Ludwig von Mises very early becomes a convert to the ideas of Carl Menger's and Böhm-Bawerk's, even though he didn't study directly with these men. And his work bore strong resemblances to theirs, especially when it came to theories of money, interest, and capital. In his most significant theoretical work, the 1911-1912 Theory of Money and Credit, he met with a mixed international reception. And what we also see is reviewers suggesting that perhaps the school had run its course by this point in time, given the kind of lack of novelty that was coming out in the work of people like Mises and others. Mises's book was widely reviewed, and it's worth a read even today. But at that point, it was reviewed in Austria, England, Italy, Germany, the United States. And prominent reviewers were Knut Wicksell, the Swede, and also a young John Maynard Keynes. And their reviews are quite interesting, again, in trying to think about what a school is, especially as the school label is typically attributed from the outside. Wicksell described the book as fluent and earnest, and that Mises deserved credit for honoring the ideas of his predecessors, which formed the foundations of his own work. Nevertheless, Wicksell deemed that Mises had not succeeded in constructing a coherent theoretical edifice. Quote, he is not immune from a general tendency for eclectic, indecisive statements. All too vague, insufficiently developed claims, and indeed open contradictions arise not infrequently. Wicksell maintained that the strongest aspects of Mises's work, ironically, were its practical and not its theoretical dimensions. When Mises descended from, quote, the vertiginous heights of abstract theory to approach the realm of practical monetary matters, unquote, his work shone. Wicksell, however, struggled to see how Mises's work surpassed Wieser's, Menger's, or his own. So we see Wicksell, who's often also associated with the Austrian school, raising some questions about what was coming out in this new generation, whether there was a transmission of ideas that was truly valuable. The Keynes review is terrible, but instructive as well. In contrast to Wicksell, Keynes's review is superficial and glib. It's not clear how well he understood German, frankly. Yet it articulated many common criticisms. Keynes found the book enlightened in the highest degree possible, but its abstractness offered little constructive insight into monetary or banking policy. Mises's predilection for, quote, criticism of imperfect theories was an inadequate substitute for creative thinking. Keynes passed a damning verdict on Mises and the Austrian School. Quote, Dr. Mises strikes an outside reader as being the very highly educated pupil of a school, once of great eminence, but now losing its vitality. One more quote. One closes the book, therefore, with a feeling of disappointment that an author so intelligent, so candid, and so widely read should, after all, help one so little to a clear and constructive understanding of the fundamentals of his subject. While this would be one of the first run-ins between Keynes and the Austrian School, the Keynes-Hayek exchange is probably much more famous. We can already see here the contours of a discussion about whether there was a school, and whatever that tradition was at the end of the 19th century, it running aground a little bit in the 1900s and early 1910s. As for the school itself, we have seen that the two leading exemplars of the third generation, Schumpeter and Mises, seemed ill-suited to perpetuate it, whatever reason that was, because Schumpeter because of his eclecticism and his disinterest in schools, or Mises because of his mixed reputation. What's interesting is when members of the fourth post-World War I generation emerged, they referenced a different man, Hans Meyer, as the father of a new Viennese school. Hans Meyer has gotten very little attention with the exception of the brilliant work by Hans-Jörg Klausinger, which I highly recommend, especially in the history of political economy. He's written the defining article on Hans Meyer. And I'll talk about him in a second and why he would become the basis for a so-called new Viennese school in the 1920s. Okay. Conditions in post-World War I Vienna impacted the school fundamentally and definitely shift its trajectory in a meaningful way. The main Austrian Economics journal, their Zeitschrift, fared really poorly. War shortages led to a decrease in size and revenue. The journal ceased publication briefly during the war, not to resume until 1921. Eugen Böhm-Bawerk, Eugen von Filipovich, they both die in the course of the war. So key professors and institutional leaders pass on, leaving an institutional vacuum for a younger generation. Friedrich Wieser was virtually the only theoretical economist inclined toward the Austrian tradition who was left with a tenured position in the Austrian Republic. And he too would pass away in the mid-1920s. He would be replaced, not by Mises, not by Schumpeter, but by Hans Meyer, who, as a Wieser student, continues a certain tradition. But in Austria of the post-World War I moment, I've written about this in my first book, we see a real conflict between conservative, nationalist, Catholic, and proto-fascist individuals and intellectuals, and more socialist inclined individuals. And at the university, the most prominent figure who taught economics and social theory was a conservative nationalist proto-fascist by the name of Ottmar Spahn. And Spahn would play a really important role in many ways by antagonizing the younger generation and forcing them to seek other alternatives to his theorizations. But what's also interesting is that it was in Spahn's classes on economics where students like Friedrich Hayek, Herbert Furth, Gottfried Haberler, Oskar Morgenstern first encountered Menger's work, Böhm's work, and others. So to this post-war generation, this is Hans Meyer. That's Friedrich Hayek. We'll get to him in a second. So this is Hans Meyer. We will return to him a little bit later. But to the fourth generation, intellectually curious and academically driven, Friedrich Hayek and another man by the name of Herbert Furt, who will be important later. They gravitated to the most lively and popular circle at the university, which was Ottmar Spahn's circle, or the Spahnkreis, to use the German. However, this group was, as I said, proto-fascist, ultra-nationalist, anti-socialist, anti-modernist, anti-democratic. They were anti a lot of things. And very quickly, Furt, Hayek, eventually Morgenstern and Haberler would find themselves excommunicated from this kind of cult-like group. Furt enjoined Hayek to start a circle. This circle was called the Geistkreis, the spirit circle. And this assemblage of bourgeois students, often Jewish, took an ecumenical approach to intellectual life, weaving together literature, philosophy, history, science, and economics. There's actually a forthcoming dissertation and book on this group that out by a Princeton scholar that we should all be looking forward to getting. The circle of about 25 men, women were not allowed to participate, met fortnightly for about 17 years. And it had a fascinating group of figures, many of whom end up in Mises's famous circle in a couple of years in the mid-20s. Furt, Hayek, Morgenstern, Haberler, the economist Fritz Machlup, the philosophers of social science, Alfred Schutz, Felix Kaufmann, Carl Menger, the son of Carl, the mathematician and also economist, he joins. The philosopher Erich Voegelin is in it, and a number of other really important figures. This is a major meeting point for intellectual life. While the interests of the circle were quite diverse, economists dominated in these proceedings, especially Hayek. These figures were in the thrall of Carl Menger. And more importantly, and this often gets lost, Friedrich Wieser. Wieser, of course, still was teaching at the university when they all arrived, so they were exposed to his works directly, even more so than Böhm's. And so it would make sense that he was the touchstone, not Böhm, and through Böhm, Mises, at least not in their training. Wieser's courses were a gateway. His textbook, Social Economics, became their Bible. This book is neglected, but really important. The American economist Wesley Clare Mitchell argued it holds a place in the literature of the Austrian School, such as John Stuart Mill's political economy holds in the literature of classical theory. It provided an introduction to marginal utility theory, but it also ranged far and wide. It enjoined economists to rethink the social implications of economic theory. By the mid-1920s, the school was on firmer footing thanks to Wieser's tutelage and the Geistkreis, and also through the succession of Meyer, who always kept a large number of economics students around him. By 1927, Paul Rosenstein-Rodan, an important development economist in his own right in the 1940s and 1950s, who was a young devotee and assistant to Hans Meyer, he wrote in one of his important articles in an Italian journal on complementarity that one could talk easily about a new Austrian school following Wieser, following Meyer, and congregating around Rosenstein, around Leo Schoenfeld, and a few others. So it's Meyer, who was recently appointed to his master's chair, who seemed to lead the current school, not Schumpeter or Mises. Meyer was a problematic leader, however, for a number of reasons. He was an irascible man, ready for a feud. He struggled to produce academic work, never completing a monograph despite promising and under-delivering at almost every turn. However, his theoretical work was inspiring to younger scholars. He picked up on Wieser's work and developed what he called a causal genetic approach to economic phenomena. So he was interested in the ways in which time impacted the movements of prices and values and costs. And in his approach, he tried to stepwise follow these phenomena in time. However, his lack of creativity and productivity frustrated younger scholars, especially those who were trying to establish themselves as professionals. Morgenstern, who tried to play nice with Meyer but did not like the man, confided his frustrations to his diary. Quote, "Yesterday, I met with Ewald Schams at Café Reichsrat. We should complain about Meyer. Why doesn't Meyer work? He doesn't write. He doesn't read. He doesn't finish his second volume. He doesn't act on the behalf of the journal. And he sits for hours in the cafe and talks about Spahn. We, the younger generation, are all of the same opinion of him." So yeah, there's this guy who's basically clogging up the academic system and not really advancing a shared program. So Morgenstern and his cohort increasingly distanced themselves from Meyer and turned to Mises. Mises's private seminar, held in the building behind me, the Wirtschaftskammer, become the center of activity for Austrian economists, even though Mises still hesitated to call it a school, community, or sect, yet rightly so. Not only were ideas fairly diverse and free-flowing in the private seminar, but Mises lacked in many ways the institutional grounding that a school could really use. He was not a tenured professor. He could not advise doctoral students. He only really served for Machlup as a doctoral advisor, none of the other ones. So his position was kind of marginal or tangential in the Austrian intellectual world, which made it hard for him to be a true leader, propagator of a school. That said, we begin to see the direction that the school will take under Mises's leadership. Even though he claimed to have an open and freewheeling society, nevertheless, observers said that this group was narrowing. It wasn't the same as Böhm-Bawerk's famous seminar from pre-World War I. Here's a quote from an observer. "Mises was so convinced that he had exhaustively dealt with all the essential questions in the area of socialism, and that all participants in the seminar had the same opinions on the subject, that there was no reason for any such conversation to have anything to offer. All participants were expected to embrace marginal utility theory and liberal politics." This comes through if you read some of the drinking songs. It's pretty interesting. The Mises gatherings attracted international participants, including people like Lionel Robbins and Frank Knight. And it signaled to the social scientific community that there was something novel taking place in Austria, and this would come into starker relief in the 1930s. And it's in these interactions with people like John Maynard Keynes, of course, with the early Chicago School over ideas of capital and production, and also in the advancement of a socialist calculation debate involving Hayek and Oskar Lange. These discussions indicated both to the international community, but even more importantly to the Austrians themselves, that they were doing something distinctive. And so this is where we begin to see conversations again about a distinctive tradition. In the interest of time, I'm going to skip over the Keynes story, socialist calculation debates, because these are more familiar. I'm going to focus in quickly on the Chicago one because it's interesting when two kind of ideological, intellectual comrade groups also come into conflict. And in many ways, this enriched both traditions. This capital debate distinguished the Austrians from their liberal peers in the United States. In his search for a working concept of capital and a theory of capital, Frank Knight, the Chicago economist and friend of the Mises Kreis who had visited, he fell into some difficulties with the Austrians. Fundamentally, he and the Chicago School fundamentally disagreed on the nature and composition of capital, which led to divergent theories about production in the business cycle. Knight believed that the starting point for Austrian school research, Böhm's capital theory, which I can talk about in questions and answers, was erroneous. In a letter to Morgenstern, Knight argued that, quote, "any theory of cycles or any other phase of economic life based on Böhm-Bawerk's theory of capital is necessarily and egregiously wrong." Böhm had predicated his theory on roundaboutness of production, so on time preferences, and the period of production would determine calculations, but also entrepreneurial calculations and the business cycle. The more time allotted for production processes, the greater the output and return on investment, but also the greater the uncertainty if the business cycle turns. Knight saw this approach as unrealistic and untenable methodologically. He said one could not measure the period of production with any accuracy, and so you couldn't explain capital growth or the business cycle using it, not in a strict sense. Morgenstern, but to a greater degree, Hayek defended the Austrian time preference and period of production. Hayek claimed that Knight's approach oversimplified production processes, and it used a homogeneous concept of capital that didn't allow for the substitutability of goods and didn't allow for a full appreciation of how capital works. This argument went back and forth for a couple years in the early 1930s with no real resolution. However, this exchange enriched the conversations and encouraged further ones, and these individuals of the Chicago School and the Austrian School would remain in touch. It had an integrative effect too for Austrians, since several of them were engaging with Knight at the same time. Fritz Machlup expressed this quite openly. What he said as he was traveling on a Rockefeller Foundation in the United States was that because of their interactions with the US economics community and the international community, the Viennese accepted their national identity and a corporate identity for their school. He says, quote, "For the first time in 1932-33, I was made aware of the fact that I was not only a member of that group as a member of the Austrian School, but a key player. Their shared interest in business cycles, time structures, and production processes distinguished them. While visiting Columbia University, Machlup offered a couple lectures titled The Older and the Younger Austrian Economics and Their Problems. He summarized how the younger Austrians now viewed themselves. If I had to state which thoughts are considered characteristical for the Austrian School, I would list chiefly three. 1, marginal utility theory. 2, opportunity cost theory. 3, capital theory, roundaboutness process and time. Alongside the earlier concepts of marginal utility, opportunity cost and capital theory had been elevated to the orthodoxy for the school as far as Machlup was concerned. And this reflected Austrians' debates with both Cambridge, but also the Chicago School, and their growing concern with global economics and contemporary affairs. By the mid-1930s, the Austrians saw no real future in their homeland, and many of them began to emigrate to try to find positions elsewhere. Most of them found a degree of success in the Anglophone world, but this also caused a great deal of pain given their sense of rootedness in their home country, not just as Austrians by nationality, but also of their tradition. We see this when Machlup writes to Hayek telling him he's accepting a position in the US. Hayek responds, lamenting the brain drain from Vienna, quote, "That you want to become a full-time economist is generally pleasing, but that you intend to emigrate from Vienna makes me really sad. I absolutely understand. Even though I am struck ever more and more strongly with the passage of years by my own expatriation, that the emigration of intellectuals from Vienna has become a mass phenomenon, especially in our economic school, and it hurts me deeply," unquote. So Hayek had left Austria in 1930, 1931 to move to London. He would return in the summers to the Salzkammergut for vacation, but he regretted that everybody was moving away. And so for Hayek, this brain drain, this emigration signaled the end of something. And this came through even when Hayek attempted in 1968 to offer a definition of the school in the Encyclopedia of Social Sciences. He basically said the tradition ended in the wilderness of emigration. What he said, quote, about his generation that they couldn't really be counted as part of the school because, quote, most of these men did the greater part of their work outside of Austria, unquote. So geographic specificity mattered for Austrianness and an Austrian school, as it should. Austria is a geographic place. However, ironically, of course, this Austrian school becomes even better known in Anglophone emigration than in its homeland. Sorry, I'm all wrapped up in my lecture. I keep leaving people behind. So we have images. This is Hayek. Here, Hayek and Mises at a Mises birthday party. Here is Fritz Machlup, to whom we will return in a second. Okay, sorry. Want to give you images. I should have been sending them through more quickly. So the school becomes better known after its Anglophone emigration. It became really popular, especially in the form that Mises advocated, to a lesser extent Hayek, with conservatives and libertarians, because Austrians and Austrianness projected an image of status, cosmopolitanism, authority that resonated with elites in the United States and in England. Austria as a symbol carried with it an old world charm, and it lent a patina of sophistication to anti-New Deal, anti-collectivist, anti-welfare state ideas that had seemed increasingly obsolete as the Great Depression advanced. New historical appreciations of the school, written starting in the 1950s, buttressed these new conceptualizations built on core principles. And what emerges is a core theoretical Austrian economics or Austrian school, a metaphorical Austrian school that was inspired by Vienna, but made in the United States and with its own doctrine. And this is where we really see a second life and a divergence from this earlier eclecticism. Nevertheless, I don't want to say that the Austrians following Hayek gave up on their ideas of maintaining a kind of school. Obviously, they were in touch with one another. They worked with one another for the decades that remained in their life. They also made several attempts in the early post-war years to meld ideas and institutions and rebuild an actual school in their homeland. These efforts met with varying degrees of success. Hayek returned to Vienna in 1946, and after it, he wrote to the Rockefeller Foundation saying, quote, "There is clearly an opportunity to preserve Vienna as an intellectual center, and the Austrians themselves are trying hard to get the help of those people who during the interwar period have left Austria. I am naturally most interested in seeing the tradition in economics preserved." Hayek proposed, quote, to get some of the Austrian economists who are now located in the United States or in England to go to Vienna for a short, concentrated course, unquote. He mentioned Haberler, Machlup, Morgenstern, Mises, and Schumpeter. By 1947, Hayek and Morgenstern had begun to outline a seminar in Vienna involving Haberler, Schumpeter, Hayek, and others. And Morgenstern rounded up funds from the Rockefeller Foundation for the venture and got travel funding for himself, Haberler, Machlup, Schumpeter, but Machlup and Schumpeter both canceled. This 4-week trip was encouraging. It also highlighted the unlikelihood of reestablishing their former school. In their reports back to the Rockefeller Foundation, they celebrated the enthusiasm for a reestablishment, but also the dismal conditions, especially at the University of Vienna. Morgenstern, while there, had taught on economic theory, especially marginal utility theory, and his new interest, game theory. Haberler presented on international trade theory, and Hayek lectured on monetary theory and business cycles. They met with a receptive audience. Their lectures attracted hundreds of people. Their seminars drew 50 to 80 students. Students appeared eager and intelligent, yet inadequately prepared. Morgenstern identified a considerable interest that may produce lasting effects. But he feared that Austrian economics teaching was very poor, with ill-trained faculty. And Hayek called the people who remained in Austria mediocrities and second and third raters. Those are his phrases. He said University of Vienna had deteriorated as a consequence of the brain drain. And as a consequence, those who remained had stifled the recovery of the school, and the school really appeared moribund because all you had left was Hans Meyer, who they saw as unproductive, uncreative, and a traitor because he ended up supporting the Nazis, and acolytes of Meyer. So what Hayek said was pretty damning. The death of Richard Striegel, the one outstanding teacher in the field of economic theory, has definitely broken the great tradition of the Vienna School. Although Hans Meyer had survived the war, Hayek and his peers treated him as a persona non grata and began the erasure of Meyer from the tradition, as he was seen as beyond the pale of acceptability. So that's what they try to do in Vienna. Of course, the most famous example of school building, reimagining of the school involves Mises, and we're going to see a few examples. Mises, initially in coming to the United States around 1940, felt isolated and underappreciated. He felt angry and despondent as a consequence. He wanted to return to academia. He wanted a circle of students around him, but he struggled to make scholarly connections or find gainful employment for a number of different reasons. His first few years were quite trying. He was living in a rent-controlled apartment in Manhattan. He did not, however, receive a permanent academic position, nor did he garner academic attention for what were increasingly political and polemical writings. Eventually, he received a series of one-year fellowships from the Rockefeller Foundation to work for the National Bureau of Economic Research, and he began to receive patronage from American acolytes of his liberalism. He did attempt to renew his private seminar in 1941, and the émigrés Fritz Machlup and Helena Lieser visited, but Mises was not overly satisfied with these new American students. He said, quote, "My seminar is going on. Last week, Machlup and Lieser took part. I think that their impression was that it is still far below the Stubenring standard." Mises, despondent, referred to this period and the work that he produced as his posthumous works. He felt in many ways he was kind of dead to the academic world in this emigration and exile. Nevertheless, in the 1940s and 50s, he began to attract followers, and they began to reconstruct a circle. The climax of this new Kreis arrived in 1956, where a Festschrift was put together to celebrate Mises. While Machlup and Hayek contributed to this Festschrift, Hans and Mary Zenholz, the key figures behind the new Kreis in Manhattan, limited contributions from the earlier circle. Most of the contributions were from US Austrians. As Mises's biographer noted, quote, "The Festschrift became a faithful reflection of the change of Mises's intellectual environment. It was to be a celebration of the intellectual case for human liberty and the free market, and of the man who had done so much to develop this case," unquote. As you can see, we're not really talking about economic theory. We're not even talking about Mises's praxeology, which becomes the basis for one strand of the Austrian school. We are talking about free markets and human liberty as now a basis of what the Mises circle is about. However, this approach also does receive a boost from the earliest post-war historical conceptualization of the school. This is written by Emil Kauder, who is a German scholar, who in 1965, after publishing a series of essays, writes a fairly idiosyncratic history of marginal utility theory and a history of the so-called marginal revolution, the marginalist revolution of the 1870s. Kauder was born to a Jewish family of Bohemian ancestry in 1901. He matriculated at the University of Berlin. After the Great War, he studied with Werner Sombart. But by the 1920s, end of them, 1930s, he had turned toward more modern economics and marginal utility theory. He reported meeting Mises in 1930 and went to the seminar on a few occasions. He also entered into a lengthy correspondence with Morgenstern. And ultimately, he ends up training Ludwig Lachmann, one of the important post-World War II US Austrians, or part of the NYU tradition. Beginning in the 50s, Kauder, with the assistance of Mises and Rothbard, who got him money, he began writing articles on the history of marginal utility theory and the contributions of Menger, Böhm, and Wieser. Kauder offered a fairly idiosyncratic telling of the marginalist story, but also of the Austrian school, but it would serve as a basis for how the school gets redefined in theoretical terms. He argued, quote, several times the history of marginal utility theory had to be rewritten. Today, we recognize that the analysis of subjective elements in economic valuation starts with Aristotle. He begins a trend of thought whose traces abound in the writings of the Middle Ages, the Renaissance, and the Enlightenment. Thomas Aquinas, Hugo Grotius, Robert Turgot, Daniel Bernoulli, all featured in this new history of an idea. And this flew in the face of more conventional tellings. He argued that because of the hegemony of British classical economics, this tradition of subjective preferences and logic of choice languished for centuries. Kauder lamented that these scholars, the marginal figures, marginal utility theories, wrote in vain. They were soon forgotten. Instead, the father of our economic science wrote that water has a great utility and a small value. With these words, Adam Smith had made waste and rubbish out of the thinking of 2,000 years. The chance to start in 1776 instead of 1870 with a more correct knowledge of value principles had been missed, unquote. So he offers a scathing understanding of British political economy. He writes Adam Smith out of what he sees as a fruitful tradition. He neglects that people like Menger were deeply indebted to Smith in the name of creating this alternate tradition. The circle forming around Mises, especially Murray Rothbard, took an avid interest in Kauder's work. And Kauder viewed Mises as the true lineal descendant of Aristotle, Menger, Böhm, and the Austrian School. Quote, today, only von Mises, the most faithful student of the three pioneers, maintains the ontological character of economic laws. His theory of human action, in his words, praxeology, is a reflection of the essence of action. Economic laws provide ontological facts. The ontological structure will be materialized if the rational individual acts in a free market. So what we see here is a veneration not just of the a priori presumptions and assumptions of Mises's praxeology, but also the necessity of free markets and laissez-faire to this economic approach. Kauder proceeded in his text to excommunicate Austrians who did not fit his understanding, Viennese who did not conform, people like Auschwitz, Lieben, and crucially, Schumpeter were treated as apostates. Gone too was Hans Meyer and much of the Wieser trajectory. The Austrian school was now pretty much a school of free markets. We see the tensions that were emerging through this approach at Mises's 80th birthday, where there's an attempt to create a birthday party, as you'd imagine, for this very important figure at the age of 80. There are two groups emerging, one the US students, one the Austrian students, now in emigration. Fritz Machlup and Oskar Morgenstern, reunited at Princeton University, set in motion plans for an intimate gathering of the Viennese, at which members could swap anecdotes and sing drinking songs from half a lifetime and half a world ago. As Machlup explained to the US Austrian, Lawrence Fertig, I am sure you will understand the desire of the old guard to have the old master as much to themselves as one can decently arrange. Machlup did not deny the significance of Mises's new students. However, those US acolytes could easily organize a second big celebration in New York if they wished. Fertig, the advertising executive, libertarian journalist, and NYU trustee who had arranged Mises's appointment as a visiting professor at NYU, nevertheless wanted to join these two functions in New York. He wanted to include, quote, Mises's two star students, Machlup and Morgenstern, and he believed A New York gathering would be more appropriate. But Machlup felt that Fertig misunderstood the purpose of the Princeton event. It was a celebration not only of Mises, but also of a bygone time and place. It was sort of amusing, of course, for Fertig to call Morgenstern a student of Mises's, because Morgenstern would adamantly reject such a characterization. Machlup wrote to Fertig again, "There's a lack of understanding about the basic sentiment behind the family reunion plan for Professor Mises. How many friends of the family can one invite before it becomes just a party? The family we had in mind was the group of people who gathered around Mises every other Friday during practically all of the 1920s and the 1930s. Between Machlup, Morgenstern, Haberler, Martha Steffi Braun, Ilse Mintz, the widows of Felix Kaufmann and Alfred Schutz, and several others, a very large contingent of former Austrians lived near enough to Princeton to make this an opportunity for celebration and reminiscence. For the émigrés, the Austrian tradition was a family event, not a school event. While valuable as students, Machlup maintained that the new Misesians were not part of the Austrian family. Ultimately, the men did reach a compromise. Machlup and Morgenstern's Princeton reunion included 26 attendees with ties to Vienna. Fertig's New York event included mostly American disciples, and Machlup and one other Austrian. So what we see by Mises's 80th birthday is already kind of two competing legacies, or several. There are several Austrian varieties with different characteristics. And we will see that the Mises tradition becomes really, really important for this Austrian revival of the 1970s, which I can talk about in Q&A, but the Austrian Economics that is founded by the US individuals. This is from the birthday. It's founded, their first event is in 1974. It takes place in New England. Mises is already dead. So the Koch brothers, the billionaires who finance a lot of free market institutions, reach out to Hayek to try to create a symposium to celebrate Mises and also Austrian ideas. Ultimately, Hayek is ill and he has to pull out. So all of the members who attend sign a card wishing him well from the conference at Royalton College. And what is so striking about this card and the attendees is there's not a single person from Austria there. So Austrian Economics is revived in 1974, and Austrians have no role in it. It's interesting and ironic. So I want to go just to the last couple of attempts by the Austrians to define their school. This is in historical articles when they're talking about it. And it takes a different approach from what the Austrian economists of the US variety are trying to do. In 1968, Hayek wrote an encyclopedia article that followed some of Kauder's general contours, but because he kept his picture of original contributors to a very narrow group. He didn't look at the eclecticism of the early years or the many people involved in the earliest generations. He also limited his discussion to the first three generations, the generations of Menger, Böhm-Bawerk, and then Mises. He also restricted the school to work done in Austria by Austrians. It makes sense. So his generation represented the end of the tradition. And so by doing this, Hayek was sidestepping some of the most important questions about what makes a school and whether it continued to exist. He tried to sidestep what Austrianness was as a school, whether it was geographical, metaphorical, sociological, theoretical. However, he wasn't fully successful, because in the same encyclopedia, the same edition of that encyclopedia, Murray Rothbard wrote an article on Ludwig von Mises, and Hayek was asked to peer review it anonymously. And Hayek was greatly uncomfortable with Murray Rothbard's characterization and hagiography of Mises. Hayek confidentially spoke out against Rothbard's portrait and criticized Rothbard to the editor that Rothbard overemphasized Mises's centrality to the school and the movement as a whole. So even though he wouldn't say it openly, Hayek nevertheless raised problems. In 1979, published in 1981, Machlup updated Hayek's account with a more thorough treatment, trying to explain continuities and divergences. And to do this essay, this is it would be published in 81, called Austrian Economics by Machlup. He solicited feedback from people like Israel Kirzner, one of the leading US Austrian economists, but also from his friend and colleague Herbert Fort. In early drafts, he exposed fissures and divides within the Austrian school's foundations, but he constructed most of his article around what I find really interesting terms: Austrians, un-Austrian Austrians, and non-Austrian Austrians. Austrians were, of course, Austrian born and raised scholars who contributed to the scholarly approach. Un-Austrian Austrians were Austrian born scholars who absorbed so many other influences they could not be included as Austrian economists. And then non-Austrian Austrians were those who embraced the teachings of select Austrians and generally advanced Mises's project. So in doing this, Machlup drew a straight line from Menger to Böhm-Bawerk to Mises. Machlup also excluded Auschwitz, Lieben, Sachs, Schumpeter, and other unconventional figures. However, Fort, his friend, pushed back against this conceptualization in letters in return. He rejected Hayek and Machlup's approach. He said, "You know, I consider Hayek the dean of the Austrian School. Nevertheless, he is still only one of many members and has no authority to excommunicate those who are not fully in agreement with his views. The sentences that you quote don't contradict my opinion about Auschwitz, Lieben, and Schumpeter. Sure, they can be included in the school only with qualifications or not wholly, but that is very different from calling them un-Austrian. Incidentally, would you deny that you, Machlup, too, like every original thinker, has absorbed many other influences besides Menger, Böhm, and Wieser?" Fort felt that Machlup had written several luminaries, including Machlup himself, out of the tradition. And this was problematic. Machlup had seemed to cede Austrianism to dogmatic Americans and their teleological interpretation of the school that culminates with Mises and Rothbard. He particularly rejected that Machlup gave precedence to two ideas that were associated with Mises. This was consumer sovereignty and political individualism. He felt that these were ideological constructions of the Mises school, had nothing to do with economic theory, and need to be excluded. To sum up, because we're running out of time, Machlup tried to conciliate, and he listed consumer sovereignty and political individualism as controversial concepts beyond the other six agreed upon theoretical edifices of the school. So what we can see, just to sum up, is that the Austrian school, to the extent that it was a school, is full of detours and surprises. It is replete with ironies, none greater than the fact that we still talk about it 80 years after the end of the Viennese chapter of the story. In theory and praxis, the school has taught us about the importance of institutions and traditions, which take on lives of their own, which even founders and acolytes and theoreticians can't anticipate. In spite of accusations and acrimony, divergences and deviations, ruptures and recriminations, nevertheless, Austrian-inspired institutions persist, and they have shaped many of today's economic, political, and ideological realities. And in many ways, this, more than any set of core doctrines, has been their lasting revolution. I will leave off there. Sorry I ran a bit long, but I look forward to questions. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Janek, for this wonderful talk. Very, very interesting, very detailed, extremely pleasant to listen to you. I would have loved to hear you more, even like for another 4 hours or so. Really, so no, I really mean it. Thank you so much. So yes, Sina, we can start the discussion. Sina, please. The floor is yours.
Okay. Thank you very much. Hello, Sina. I got the emails of these seminars, but I couldn't have a chance to follow. So it's the first seminar that I follow today. Thank you very much, Janek. I think this is a wonderful text for a documentary, because we need a documentary on that. All you know, I think, about the documentary on Schumpeter. It was a 1 hour documentary, came out in 2016 or 15, something like that. And I show it to my students, and they really like it. I don't work on Austrian economics, not at all. I worked on methodological individualism. The most, the subject that I most could relate to this subject, among I work on, is methodological individualism. I wanted to listen you, because Austrian economics is a mystery for me, and I cannot say that now the mystery has disappeared. But I could actually be more familiar with the story of Austrian economics. My difficulty was always to know how to teach it. It's really difficult to teach it. I'm using, among the textbooks, Ekelund Heber textbooks. I'm teaching history of economic thought. And from the beginning of the publication year, I'm also using a course book, Heinz course book, and as he's, a descendant of Austrian economics, you could actually expect from me to teach a better way, find a better way to teach Austrian economics, but not really. I teach, of course, in the beginning, the different generations of Austrian economics, and then I just talk about some subjects like subjectivism, individualism, etc., money, and then actually I talk about all of that, referring to Menger and some of members of the school, and then I just close that part of the subject and start teaching, of course, Schumpeter. And always saying that Schumpeter come out with his own school, but there is no Schumpeter in school neither. So it's really hard to teach, know how to teach that school, because we call it as school. So thank you very much. Today I will reconsider all my teaching. I don't have a specific question. Maybe that would be actually the question, how to know how to teach Austrian economics. If you could actually recommend a book or a way to teach it, maybe your presentation could help me, then I could just actually read your paper. And the second very little question, like maybe I'll just a reminder, what you would, how you would call political individualism, what you meant by saying political individualism. That's a totally specific interest that I have, because we always associate it to individualism, methodological individualism, but you used such term, political individualism, so I was wondering what was it. And thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sina. I really appreciate these questions. I'll start with the last one first because it's the shortest. So the way that Machlup defines political individualism as he saw it in the Mises tradition was that economic liberty and freedom precedes any political freedom, and that it's only through free markets and through economic liberty that you can even achieve political autonomy as individuals. I think that how he precisely describes it is, only when individuals are given full economic freedom will you get political and moral freedom. And so any restrictions that one places on economic theater on economic freedom will lead to state coercion in the political domain. So essentially, this is an argument for a minimalist state or no state, depending on how far you want to take it. So that's political individualism as Machlup understood Mises, and I think it's pretty fair. Yeah, that methodological individualism, obviously, Schumpeter makes an attempt at defining it, and it is seen by virtually every Austrian, whether today or dating back decades, as the core principle of their inquiry. Methodologically speaking, you have to start from individuals. You have to start from, in order to understand economic phenomena, it all has to be from the individual, which then leads into subjectivism, tastes and preferences that are subjective desires inform these kinds of economic actions. So yeah, methodological individualism is in virtually every definition I've ever seen of the Austrian school, excluding those that focus sheerly on the topics that they are working on, like Machlup's 1930s definition. As to how to teach Austrian economics, I guess it depends on the audience, on what you're hoping for the students to take away. If you're trying to train them in the tradition so that they can see what they do, I think you're doing a really good job in highlighting some of the seminal texts from Menger, Böhm, Wieser, Hayek. I mean, I think that there are a number of good resources on the internet. A lot of the scholars associated with the George Mason approach to Austrian economics have great blogs and websites where they'll talk about the 5 or the 10 books you should read or you should use. And so, yeah, normally they're going to be starting with things like Principles of Economics from Menger. They might look at the investigations into the methods of the social sciences. They'll use Capital and Interest from Böhm. Wieser gets less attention, but there's some good stuff. With Hayek, Economics and Knowledge, so his article from the 1930s becomes a go-to. With Mises, you might see Theory of Money and Credit, but there's also a good chance you'll see either Human Action or socialism, his expansion of his critique of socialist calculation. I think it really depends on what you want to impart to students about the tradition. Of course, there is some really rich work from the US context too that deals a lot with entrepreneurship, processes of discovery, market processes. And that would require kind of a different conversation, but there are great works from people starting with Israel Kirzner and extending forward in time that are rich. They are indebted not just to Austrians, but also contemporary economics. So I guess it really depends on who you're looking for or looking to talk to. The other thing that I'll say about the Austrian school, and unfortunately this kind of fell out of my conversation, is that schools are defined within a broader intellectual space. And a lot of what defined the Austrian school is their opponents. So whether it was the German historical school first, or whether it was responding to Marx and Capital in the 1880s and 90s, whether it was responding to new ideas about socialization, war economies, planned economies in the teens and the 20s, Keynes in the 30s. In many ways, the Austrian school galvanized around these major debates. And I think that also is just the key part of it, that they were participants in the intellectual and political world. And so I think that they can also be really well understood if we look at some of those Streitschriften, these kind of these pamphlets, these argument pieces. That would be a completely different project than teaching them economics, Sina. So I know it's a bit off the track, but Menger writing against the German historical school, Böhm writing against Marx, Mises writing against planned economies, and Hayek doing the same. these are really rich works that give us a good way of understanding what they were about too. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Gilles, please, the floor is yours.
Yes, does it work?
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Sorry for the sun ray in my eyes, so that I'm trying to escape from it. And thank you very much for having a very nice talk. Clear, introductory, rather exhaustive, quite nice. So thank you very much. I think that many of us have learned, of course, many things. So maybe I should first indicate that my questions, I will make few remarks, along of which there will be some questions. And unlike Sina, I'm quite knowledgeable about the stuff. So I just put for everybody a reference in English of the works that I've done on Carl Menger. But of course, you know already that, right, Janek?
I do.
Okay. So now let's go into the remarks and the information. First of all, I will say something that doesn't seem obvious, but which is true when we talk about that story, is that in that case, Austria is not a country. Austria is, as you of course know, so I will say things mixed that are at the same time obvious, but sometimes have consequences that are not obvious. So sorry for the things that are obvious. As you know, Austria at the time is an empire. And where there is war right now, it was part of Austria, part of it. Not the eastern part, but if you take what they call Wilpolf, that was Lemberg. And Lemberg was, of course, a place where Menger worked as a journalist when he was young.
Yeah.
So you have to understand by Austria a much larger way of, much larger geographical part of the world, old Europe, so to speak. And also the state of mind that goes with it. Of course, the 1972 books by Johnston, The Austrian Mind, is quite old and outdated, but actually it was excellent, and it's not stupid even now. So Austria is not a country. Austria is what old Europe meant then when it was not Paris. Actually, Vienna was called the Paris der Mitteleuropa, Paris of Central Europe. And it is a state of mind which has consequences on their themes of work, on their fields of work that they chose, and of the difficulties when they had to go away from that, especially migrating to English-speaking places, be it Britain or America. You maybe mentioned it, but at some point my computer was not strong enough for all the slides and pictures that you had, so it was cut. But Mises started by going to Switzerland.
Yep.
Because in Switzerland you speak German, which is the normal language, and not the strange English language. Also, they avoided France, which has consequences as far as translations are concerned. I will say a word later on translations. So first, Austria must be understood as something which is not a country, but which is the spirit of old Europe. And when it comes to America, and it contradicts there what's already existing there. Of course, there will be convergences that you stressed, but the divergences probably are more important.
Mm-hmm.
First point. Second point, you mentioned it in your answer to Sina. The fact that there are so many surprises and unexpected twists and turns in the Austrian school is, well, there are so many reasons that you explained, factual and etc., theoretical and all that. One way to see it is that that school is very special in that they had to redefine their shape according to the opponents that they had in front of them. The German historical school, the Methodenstreit, the socialist, Marxist, planists people, the non-Marxist planists in Great Britain between the wars, that's where the road to serfdom originated, the Keynesians, and the fact that America after the Second World War was for a large part influenced by Keynesian views like Galbraith and all that. And then in the 1970s, the leftists, or the spread, the wave of left-wing thoughts around the world. This is how to make sense of the surprises, probably, by understanding that they had to redefine each time, and therefore they did not exactly say the same thing, but they had to start again, which is not the case with mainstream. Of course, there are changes, etc. But you take mainstream economists, they don't hold that they have to rebuild the old thing construction from start, from zero. Whereas the Austrians, to large extent, do that. It also explains why some of them will endorse some views and not others, and other people will, and among them, will endorse other views. And so there is not, it's very difficult. Bruce Caldwell tried to identify a core, and you did also make a list. However, it's quite difficult to do that because they have to restructure, redefine their position each time. I think that in that view, it is very important what you did to make the difference, especially the nice anecdote about the 80th birthday of Mises, to redefine the difference between the older Central European original Austrian views and the US American way of translating it, especially after South Royalton, where you finished in 1974. So one question is also for your own position. Where are you in that field? Your work is very academic, which is very praiseworthy in the context of schools that either when they are politically extreme left, right, or whatever what they are called in different countries, always have trouble of defining between sects. So that is the second question. Third point, I said I would go back to your position. Second question is your position.
I'm sorry to just be a little bit quicker because, you know, we also need to have time for other questions.
Then I will go back to the translation issue. It is not only when they had to change and go to English-speaking countries, it is not only that they had to translate their works from German to English. It is that they had to translate into the framework, the mindset of the other world in order to be understood, just in order to be understood because they wanted to get a position. So Morgenstern or von Neumann had no problem because of the mathematical parlance that they used, and which would, of course, owe them some positions. But the other ones, when they were, like Mises, coming from being the main center for seminars in Austria and Vienna to a small seminar in NYU, it was really difficult. They changed their views to a large extent. This is also why the un-Austrian or non-Austrian Austrians can be identified. If you take the works by Schumpeter written in German or those written in English, you don't have exactly the same thing because Schumpeter wanted to achieve a career, and he did actually, becoming the boss of the Association of American Economists. So this also has to be stressed. So what are you showed many sources, and I would like to know how far you went into the sources that are in America and the sources that are elsewhere, especially in Europe. But in Europe, with the war and the migration, many things have disappeared. So it is very important to use the archives. Yeah. Good on that for you, very much. How far have you been? Have you gone? Your comments on Cowder are quite right and interesting, but I will not develop because there is not enough time. So that would be the third question. So if I recap the three main, there would be more other things, but the three main issues that I raised is: one, what would you define as Austria once I have said that it is not a country in that occurrence? Second, what is your own situation in the field of American, of US Austrianism? And third, what is the, how far did you go with the archives and where did you go, etc., etc. And I would, on that, recommend to all the people who are listening, but also to the people that I know, to go back to the archives. Because the point is that those, if you don't want to be just polemical,
Gilles, I have to stop you there.
Work on the
Really,
text.
please.
That's the last word.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much. Yes, back to you, Janek.
Gilles, thank you so much for these comments. I am a big fan of your work. I cite it in my book, and so I appreciate what you have done as well in this field. To go very quickly, you're right. Austria is an empire. It is the meeting point of East and West, North and South. It is, for some of these individuals, seen as the better German culture. But this is a cosmopolitan space. It is, you're right, the heart of Europe. And so I think that for all of these individuals, they felt that they were part of this grand civilizational tradition and of producing culture. I think Erwin Decker's book gets at this well, just if we think of the title, when he talks about the Viennese students of civilization. They really felt that they were engaged in a civilizational project, a big cultural project. And so as far as Austria goes, yeah, I think that they saw it as a big, liberal, tolerant, enlightenment-bound space that they hoped to recreate. And they tried to do this in all of their avenues. You look at something like the Mont Pelerin Society after World War II, that was so old world, so European. And it was trying to recall this kinder, gentler space, this world of yesterday, to quote Stefan Zweig, as they understood it. So yeah, I think that is, you're entirely right. And I think as well, yeah, divergences are more interesting. The point you made about mainstream economics is also really interesting, because I think why we lose some of the Austrians' traces is because some of them get picked up when they get the jobs, when they translate their work and they end up at universities, well, their work gets subsumed into the mainstream. And we can see this most clearly with Haberler and Machlup, who are very successful. Schumpeter too, but Machlup and Haberler become professors at Princeton and Harvard. They are involved with all the major economic associations, and they're entirely taken up in their various fields. And so, yeah, ultimately, then, yeah, the Austrian school can also be seen as what's left in some ways, the stuff that doesn't get collected into the mainstream. And that's why it ends up seeming maybe weirder, and the attempt to define it as something so different is important for at least people who continue to practice it and remain kind of at a distance from the mainstream. Okay, as for my position, the way that I've always seen my project is as a critical, I'm a historian who is critical of the subjects that he studies. I am not an advocate of any approach practiced today or even back in the day. I am critical and somewhat skeptical of kind of liberal theories in general and methodological individual theories in general. That's my own intellectual and methodological prior. But what I tried to do, and this gets to the third point, is I tried to engage these thinkers on their terms, which meant, yeah, going to the archives, going to the sources, letting them speak for themselves. I was not interested in trying to say, well, Mises and praxeology is wrong or bad or stupid. What I was trying to say is this is how they presented it. This is how it was understood. This is how people might have criticized it at the time. I was trying to report it based as I saw it in archives. Now, as for the archives, I was I won't say that I was exhaustive, but I was in the archive. I was in dozens of archives. I was in the papers of course, Morgenstern, Hayek, Mises, Machlup, Schumpeter. I went to the Hoover Institute in California. I was in Duke University that has the Morgenstern papers and the Menger papers. I was in Vienna in the State Archive. I was at the Institute for Economic Research at Vienna. I was in London at the Chatham School to look at Rosenstein's papers, London School of Economics to get things from Robbins on Hayek. My book has a much fuller list, but basically most of what I was doing was archivally based. While yes, I was using published resources, a lot of the richest material was in their correspondence. And their correspondence is just amazing, especially if we're trying to get an interactional style. And a lot of what I talk about, and I guess this is sort of indebted to philosophers of science and science studies, people like Ludwig Fleck and Bruno Latour, of course, is that so much of what makes science is in fact interactional style within groups. And so in order to understand that, you're right, you can't just read a published paper. You have to look at drafts, correspondence, disputes, petty jealousies. So yes, sources mattered. And lastly, on translation, you're right, math made it easier for somebody like Morgenstern. But what's interesting is most of these people were quite well versed in English. But more to the point, and I couldn't talk about this, is that almost everybody in the generation that ends up in the United States had already spent a year or two of fellowship in the United States or in England. They'd all received Rockefeller foundations. Austria was, in fact, the most successful country, and at this point it is a country in the 1920s. It was the most successful in getting social scientists fellowships to go to the States to study techniques in the United States. So many of these people had pretty good working English, which facilitated their move in ways that, in fact, German scholars struggled. But you're right, somebody like Mises, who was older, while he valued English, it was much easier for him to go to Switzerland. Although he was in Geneva, and in the League of Nations space, so he was using German, but and his circle in Geneva was German speaking, but there was also a lot of French there.
Which is quite normal for Europeans.
Of course. And I didn't mention it. I was also in the League of Nations archives, which were fascinating in Geneva. Those are untapped resources. So anyway.
I just say great work and go
Thank
on.
you.
And make other students and other people do the same. Because that's the only way that ideological impact can be refrained to serious academic work or even non-academic, but non-necessarily from the start politically polemical. That's our work as scientists, to keep knowledge at first rank, I think.
Thank you.
Great, thank you.
Thank you so much. There is a question from Brian in the discussion. Brian, do you want to ask it out loud, or maybe if I could, before asking Brian's question? I mean, I have a whole series of questions, but I would ask maybe one of them. Reading your book, I got the impression that basically the marginalization of the Wieserian line somehow was maybe a major factor, was precisely the collaboration of Carl Menger with the Nazis, and the fact that when other Austrians came back, he became precisely, as you said, a persona non grata, and because he was in a way the representative of, he had been chosen by Wieser, right? So is that really, can we say, because you know how, as you said in the memoir, in the introduction, I mean, I don't remember if it was an introduction or a preface, but Hayek also laments in a way how the Wieserian line had been completely sidelined in a way.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think? So Hans Meyer's collaboration with the Nazis, let's say certain social elements in Wieser which maybe did not work well with the otherly liberal tendency that the Austrians took later on. What are the other, do you think, causes of this entire marginalization of the Wieserian tradition, and basically that the Böhm-Bawerkian tradition embodied by Mises and Hayek became somehow the only, at least by and large, the dominant current in the legacy?
Okay, yeah, I'll try to tackle a few things here. First, Brian, I appreciate your question. I would say the only other figure that the same sort of excavation or exegetical work in their philosophical views that I would know that I can think of is, well, Mises and Hayek. Also, people are really interested in how far back you can trace ideas. But I think that Mises again goes back to these Aristotelian elements, but that's mostly because of Rothbard's and Kauder's reading of Mises. I don't think that was a core presupposition of Menger, of Mises's, if you read his work. But this gets recast, especially for Rothbard, who's trying to look for kind of natural and foundational origins of these thoughts. Hayek, I think there's so much fascination with Hayek, and we've seen great work on Hayek by, again, Hans-Jörg Klausinger, Bruce Caldwell. There is this attempt to tease out all of the rich influences, and Hayek is a versatile thinker that he draws on a lot of traditions, but I don't think it's necessarily trying to go all the way back to antiquity in the same way. So I hope that that's a start of an answer before I go to Sina's questions. Wieser is tough in a few ways. One, there is this tendency in his earlier work to also establish kind of a naturalization of certain rules that ends up seeming a little fishy to those who follow the Böhm tradition more closely. But I think that the bigger thing is, this turn towards sociology that he embarks on during World War I and more pronouncedly after. And so he's writing on things like power at great length. His work on social economics, I talk about it more in my book, and Stefan Kolev has also done some great stuff on Wieser. But Wieser has this multi-stage understanding of economic theory and economic processes. And so in social economics, he begins constructing a 4-level approach to understanding economic phenomena. While the Austrians traditionally are focused on the individual at the lowest level, he starts building up larger groupings that have their own dynamics, culminating, of course, in at the world or the global level, having its own dynamics, sociological powers, institutional effects. But he says that, we need to, in fact, move beyond the individual. We need to move beyond Volkswirtschaft, which focuses on the folk or an individual people, national economics, Nationalökonomie, and we need to get to a kind of world level. So he's developing something that isn't fully grounded in a methodological individualism anymore, which I think would be quite problematic. I think there was also a lot of people had a hard time with this kind of causal genetic approach of the unfolding understanding phenomena as they change from an ideal state over time. There were a lot of moving parts. It was almost purely verbal, but also not that explanatory. And this is where Meyer goes. Rosenstein and Schoenfeld do a better job with it, but I think there just aren't enough people picking up. The other problem is that group, Rosenstein, Schoenfeld, Englander, a few others, none of them end up teaching in kind of theoretical economics. None of them transmit much after the 1920s. And because Meyer was unproductive, students shifted away from him. And then eventually, he endorses the Nazi takeover. Basically, there's no desire to engage him. And there already hadn't been much of one, but he becomes a scoundrel. He is really, if you read the post-war interviews to a person, they scorn him and loathe Meyer. So I think that's really what happens. And I think that because he becomes the real exemplar of the Mises tradition, of the Wieser tradition, he drops away. But Wieser is fascinating for a number of different reasons, and deserves, I think, more reading. Not so much for the reasons why he's always read, because he gives one of the early definitions of Grenznutzen, so marginal use, marginal utility. But some of his ideas, again, on kind of non-equilibrium economics, the kind of multidimensionality of exchange, these are really fascinating ideas that are picked up very well in Rosenstein when he writes an article on complementarity that shows how sophisticated market exchanges and economic exchanges.
Very interesting. Yes, thank you. Thank you so much. I have maybe one, I have actually so many other questions, but before asking another question, I would ask if those present, specifically the ladies present, if you have other questions, please come forward. Or Brian, if you want to maybe elaborate on your question and what Janek said in response to your question. Oh, please, you are mute, so please unmute your microphone.
Yeah. Is it for me? Yeah. I have one short question.
No,
you,
Gilles, sorry,
No?
it's Brian. It's Brian's asking the question. But Brian, you are still, we don't hear you. Brian? Or at least I can't hear you.
Yeah, I can't either.
So you are not mute, but I think, could you speak? Brian? Oops.
Still can't hear you. Sorry.
Ah, it's a pity. Okay. So let me before giving you the floor, Gilles. I was very curious. I mean, I really like reading your book. I had like a whole range of questions because you say you make so many like passing remarks which are extremely insightful. I mean, for example, I just give 2 examples, 3 examples maybe. Very interesting things that you mentioned. The influence of the dispute between Menger and Schumpeter on Adolf Wagner and how he changed at the end of the day, the distance that he took from Schumpeter. Then the Filipovic intervention in the famous conference in Vienna about the role of values in science, which seems to be at odds with what would become the standard position of Austrian. Even Mises would always say that economics is a value and normative free, right? I mean, he would insist on the fact that what he's doing is non-normative science and that there can be no science of values or norms or whatsoever. And another interesting passage in your book, which I was amazed by, it was the exchange between Schumpeter and Weber. During the law. I think those are very significant. I mean, I'm just giving them as examples, but there's so much insight going on beyond these specific historical moments. But one specific question is about Morgenstern. You refer in the book to various episodes where Morgenstern was quite critical of Hayek. I mean, wrote to Serfdom. He called it more or less an ideological book, and that, for him, as you say, he says, I think at some point he says that I don't like planning, but that is not the way to proceed, saying that planning is impossible. You can say that planning is not good, but you can't say that it is impossible. And then when they gave the Nobel Prize to Hayek, which was, I think Morgenstern was quite upset about it. So I think you make it very clear about Morgenstern's attitude towards Hayek. But what was his attitude towards the Austrian School in general? I don't think you discussed that much. How did he define his? I mean, basically, I think you got my question. So that I couldn't get it completely reading the book and now listening to your talk.
Yeah, goodness. Yeah, I would say that with regard to the Methodenstreit, I think for almost everybody who was younger, they saw it as kind of fruitless, this dispute. And what I mean by that is that it didn't have to be such a clear either or between empirical work and theoretical work, that in many ways they could enrich one another. And yeah, Wagner is the clearest example, maybe Max Weber as well, of coming out of a German historical tradition, but then recognizing the need for sound theoretical foundations, that there isn't just pure empiricism. I'm just going to go into archives or do statistical work, and there's no judgment. We know this, Weber's work on objectivity makes this very clear. And so, yeah, I think that younger generation, they evolve away from Schmoller, but they have to do it carefully because Schmoller is so powerful in the German academy. Yeah, the value judgment debate is really interesting. Filipovich is not really regarded as a theoretician himself or a methodologist himself. In many ways, he's a synthesizer and a successful one. And I think he didn't realize that he was going to kick off this major dispute, because, yeah, what he wrote on at that Verein meeting was, he's talking about productivity as a concept, but because the way he talked about it introduced certain values and priors, people like Sombart and Weber were quite upset about this. And then this kicks off a dispute that was simmering for a while, right? This younger generation was not really content with the way that the Schmoller generation pretended to be doing an objective value-free science that was quite clearly value-laden. And that the problem was they failed to acknowledge it, right? That's Weber's big point, I would argue. But yeah, so Filipovich gets involved kind of indirectly, but he kicks this discussion off. And yeah, we then see a further, I think, coming together of somebody like a Weber and a Mises, for example, who do have some exchanges, but I think that their views on science, objectivity, value-free science converge in many ways. The Schumpeter-Weber exchange, yeah, it's almost too good to be true, but it's attested in memoirs from the time, so I'll believe the story if I can't disprove it. Yeah, I enjoyed telling it mostly because, I mean, I think it pointed to a Viennese style of inquiry more than anything else. Yes, Schumpeter, of course, has his own methodological commitments, but there is this sort of ironical disputation style, which so matters to the Austrians. And so that story works really well in that context, that Schumpeter has this very, I think, very funny and withering debate style. And you see it there, and you also see it in Capitalism, Socialism, and Democracy. And it's why people misread that book, because they miss the intensely ironical tone of the piece. And even somebody like kind of Mises and Mises students will see him as a defender of socialism, which is absolutely not what Schumpeter is arguing in that book. The exact opposite, in fact. So anyway, that's what I like about the Schumpeter-Weber exchange. Morgenstern, we have, his archives are maybe the most extensive of anyone's. I mean, Hayek's are quite extensive. Mises's are getting better, or are better now. But yeah, he kept diaries from his teenage years that you can read. You've drafts of everything, because he was able to get out and bring all of his materials to the States. So they're all deposited at Duke. And then his letters are also the letters he sent. If he didn't have copies in his own files, if he was sending them to other Austrians, they're all where the other Austrians' papers are. And those are mostly at the Hoover Institute in California. So you can just paint a really rich picture. And his diary is impressive. A number of people have mined it. I mean, Robert Leonard has done an amazing job in his history of early game theory, and von Neumann in showing these interactions through his letters. Look, Morgenstern is an ambitious, egocentric person too, as is Hayek, as are most of these figures. They have big egos, lots of ambitions. They think very highly of their own originality. And with regard to Hayek, yeah, I think he was disappointed that Hayek, who for him had become fairly political or polemical, was the Austrian who won a Nobel Prize. He thought that he should win. I mean, it's as simple as that. And if not him, you know, maybe Haberler, maybe Machlup, but Hayek, it really rubbed him the wrong way. And they had disputes going back to the 20s and 30s. Some of Morgenstern's earliest methodological works, The Limits of Economics, starting in 1929, I want to say, are pretty critical of Mises and some of the other Austrians, while also critical of the way that mainstream economics is developing. And so Hayek kind of rejects Morgenstern's methodological turn, and it goes both ways. So that goes for them. Morgenstern, I think, with regard to the school, yeah, he didn't have much time for it, I think. He really was invested. He really enjoyed the new direction with game theory that he took. He did engage in some issues of international trade theory that weren't far from Machlup. And they did exchange letters on this sort of stuff, but they definitely charted different courses. So I think for Morgenstern, he wasn't interested in being part of this tradition, especially as it was evolving after the war. And so he, in his letters, and in his diaries, he's just very clear at separating himself from any of them.
Thank you so much. Very, very interesting. I mean, yes. Yes, Gilles.
Very, very shortly, but you are right, Sina, to ask the questions first, because I will just have follow-up on not many things, two things. Weber on Schmoller, you will find, I don't remember if I put it in the English translation of the work, but in the French first edition of my criticism of classical political economy, there is a letter by Weber where he's praising Schmoller, is writing to Schmoller and saying, you did so much, etc. But actually, if you read between the lines, you also see why the most youngest, the Jüngere, not the youngest school of, but the Jüngere, is taking distance, is distancing itself from the Schmoller thing. And there is the letter, there is the reference, etc. So just, I mean, now about Filipovic, I have a question for you. He was, I may be wrong, but he was registered in both the philosophy department when he was a student and the economics department in Vienna University. And it's very difficult to find other people, other students that were registered in both things. How would you say that the teachings of the philosophy department in Vienna and the economics department in Vienna did cross or did not cross? It's quite difficult to find material for that thing. And when you look at the archives of Menger, he has commented on many works. But first, he never did publicly on the works of his fellow teachers in the philosophy department. And when he wrote in the notes for himself, he says, well, I don't want to take a stand, etc. So about philosophical influence, there is much that I have studied, but how would you say, is it possible to trace more of the influence of the philosophy department of the Viennese people, Bolzano, etc., when they were, and the economists? In my view, it's like they were fighting both the Germans, but parallel. And as parallel don't touch, there are not. Filipovic is an example of someone. Do you have other examples that you would put forth?
Yeah, that is such a good question. Like in my book, what I try to suggest is that the philosophical traditions that are developing around the turn of the century, if we think about sort of inspired by Mach, for example, But then if we also think about the first Vienna circle, so these anti-foundationalist thinkers around Neurath and Philipp Frank, who are interested in Pierre Duhem and Poincaré. There's clearly some cross-pollination, but yeah, it wouldn't have been at an institutional level, because you're right, there are very few people that are in the two different faculties. And they wouldn't have been trained that way. And so they wouldn't have had the opportunities necessarily to study in the seminars of both of those traditions at the same time. So yeah, I mean, a lot of the philosophy that people like Hayek would have been picking up, it wasn't through their schooling, it was independently done. The only figures who really, and now I'm thinking a little bit later, I'm thinking about the Vienna circle of logical empiricism, right? You have some people who cross over, right, who do have training that spans a little bit, but the people I'm thinking about like Kaufmann and Schutz, most notably.
That's already the interwar, right?
Yeah,
That's already the interwar.
This is interwar. Like prior to that, I would not say that that earlier generation is trained in philosophical work in a meaningful way. The Mises, Schumpeter, Meyer generation, and the one prior to it too. I mean, I don't think, Böhm and Wieser, you wouldn't, their understandings are fairly superficial when it comes to philosophy. So yeah, that is an interesting one. I don't really have a good answer, except for that, yeah, the university, the way that institutions were structured at that time, they really were separate, entirely separate.
I do agree. I do agree with that. It's quite difficult, but it's also interesting not only to say that those economists were not such really trained in philosophy, but the fact that they have been fighting the Germans, but parallel.
Yeah.
And when they started to intercross, that's already the interwar. That's the fact that there is the Carl Menger, the Sun mathematical colloquium. There is Mises seminar. There is also Schlick's Vienna Kreis. And that's another time already. It's the Enkel Schüler of the grandsons, the grand philosopher. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, just one other point on that too, which is so interesting, right, is when Mises begins writing his epistemological works that lead to praxeology in the early 30s, late 20s, early 30s. And of course, he's presenting this work in his seminar. And, Kaufmann is fairly unenthusiastic about it, as is Carl Menger, the son. Those who had economic philosophical training felt that Mises was naive, that his approach was naive. And of course, they didn't gain a good hearing in that circle, but they registered it in their own letters with one another, that this was not a productive direction. Morgenstern has stuff from Kaufmann about this. So yeah, you can definitely see a divergence there from more philosophically inclined and more economic inclined people.
Really, thank you very much. That's really good work that we may further on in the future.
Thank you so much. So we are already 8:22. So I don't know if Janek, I think it's already too much. So I don't want to. I have actually, to be honest, I have so many other questions. But maybe if you could accept, I would give maybe the chance for one last question from someone who hasn't asked any question so far, if that doesn't bother you, Janek?
No.
So does anyone else want to ask a question? No? Okay. So if not, I mean, because I have at least 2 or 3 other major questions actually, but I know that would take a little bit of time. So I would rather send you an email with those questions. I would really appreciate. But again, I highly encourage you to read Janek's book. Fantastic achievement really in the history of economic thought, in social history, in intellectual history. I would say very measured assessment of the legacy of the Austrian school in all its complicated and very interesting aspects. I mean, good aspects, bad aspects, and so on. But specifically, I think one major point is the huge difference between the legacy of the school when it was still based in Europe, in Central Europe, and when it moved to the US, where it became, to a large extent, a merely political project, maybe we could put it that way. Whereas back in Central Europe, it was indeed, it did have some political aspects to it, but the scientific and the theoretical and the philosophical aspect was absolutely significant. I think that's the least we could say, which is also a very clear image that you give in the book, and you emphasize even at the very end when you insist that maybe one way to reinvent the legacy of the Austrian school would be to go back to what was happening in Central Europe rather than what is happening or what has been happening in the US in the past 3 or 4 decades. Thank you so much, Janek. I really appreciate your participation. It was a huge and immense pleasure for me to get to see you. I really hope to be able to invite you again, preferably for an in-person talk.
Yes, thank you, Sina. Thank you for all the wonderful questions. Yeah, if you have any questions, please feel free to send them along to me. And yeah, hopefully next time in Lausanne or in Paris, it would be fabulous.
Absolutely, it would be fabulous. Thank you so much to all the others. Thank you for your presence. And just before you leave, I remind you that next week we have the next session of this seminar, where I will have the pleasure of welcoming Sheila Do, who will talk about the role of history in economics and the methodological and ontological aspects of how economics is done in various schools of thought in economics, both historically and more contemporary approaches. So if you are free, don't hesitate to join that talk as well. Have an excellent afternoon, evening, or else, depending on where you are, and hope to see you very soon. And again, thank you so much, Janek.
Thank you,
And
everyone.
others, of course.